Mr. Fraker? Much against his better judgment, Fraker turned around again. Get out, leave tonight, while you still can. Whitaker looked him up and down. You're not so, tainted. Yet. Don't worry about me, said Fraker, his voice wavered with fear, so much so that he scared himself. He walked away as confidently as he could, but it was all he could do to stop himself from running. I'm damned, Mr. Fraker, Whitaker shouted behind him, and Fraker quickened his step. Get out of this nightmare while you still can. Fraker was at the stairs now, he took them 3 at a time. But he could still hear Whitaker, who must have come out into the corridor, but thankfully hadn't come any further. Fraker. If you have 1 ounce of pity in you, you'll tell Randall you couldn't find me. Fraker was at the front door now, he kicked it open, it closed behind him, just as Whitaker shouted, better still, tell him I'm dead. The cold air outside hit Fraker like a slap in the face, taking his breath away. He staggered, suddenly dizzy, and had to rest his back against the building to stop himself from keeling over. He bent forwards and rested his hands on his knees and gulped down air until, thankfully, the nausea passed without him actually throwing up. Fraker walked over to the car like a drunk and clambered inside. Instinctively, he reached over to the glove compartment and took out the hip flask. But once he got a whiff of the whiskey inside, it made his stomach churn. Great, he said to his reflection in the rear-view mirror, and screwed the top back on. He couldn't even numb this growing feeling of dread with his beloved alcohol. Fuck this, he spat and fired up the car. He stomped on the accelerator and sped away, accompanied by the squeal of tires. Bill Fraker had no idea just what the hell he was in the middle of, but he instinctively knew it was all wrong. Things were happening around him that just didn't add up, and he knew now that he should have just refused the boss's request flat out straight away. But still, like Whitaker said, it wasn't too late for him to get out, and hopefully that meant Charlie too. And that was all he really needed to know. Whatever this unnamed menace stalking Whitaker and McCulloch was, it wouldn't get them. This nightmare was over, no matter what the cost. The boss would understand. That look in his eye told Fraker that much. All that remained was to get Charlie and get gone. And to hell with the rest of the players in this sick game. Literally, if needs be. Fraker fumbled inside his coat pocket as he drove and pulled out his mobile. He needed to call Charlie and tell him to leave McCulloch's number for the yank and then get out of there, no questions asked. The last thing he needed was to have to face Randall and tell him they were quitting. God only knew what his reaction would be. Shit, Charlie's number just rang out, not even tripping to voicemail. Fraker ended the call and tried again. The Pratt always had his phone with him, so what was so different about tonight? Ishrel watched Whitaker as he frantically locked his door and stepped back into the room. He was a broken man, Ishrel's favorite kind. He had been perched in a corner of the ceiling listening to the 2 men for a minute or so now. It had been much easier than he had anticipated tracking Fraker here. He had thought he'd lost him at one point, but when he said Whitaker's name at the door, it pulled him here like a magnet. Ripples. Poor Tommy Whitaker had no protection at all, but he obviously thought he had. He recognized Mary's work the moment he saw the tooth. She was well known to Ishrel and his kind, very theatrical, but harmless. She did possess some power stolen or stumbled upon over the years, but little else. If anything, she was a great help to the cause. People get sloppy when they think they are protected. That was the main reason she was allowed to continue her work. That and the amusement value. Things were finally taking shape. Maybe the collector had been right all along with his use of the humans, not that he would ever admit that to Randall. Anyway, now that they had Whitaker, McCulloch was but a hop, skip, and a jump away from damnation. And with that thought warming his frozen heart, Ishrel melted back into the ether. Be back soon, Tommy Whitaker, he said, even though he knew the man couldn't hear him. He still delighted to see Whitaker shiver all the same. What was that incredibly annoying noise? Randall stood in the near darkness of Fraker's and Charlie's room listening to what sounded like someone blowing bubbles into a glass of water. It took him a few moments until he finally realized it was coming from Charlie's mobile phone, which was sitting on a coffee table bubbling away. Its owner was in a deep sleep on the sofa next to it. Randall would have thought the annoying ring tone would have been grating enough to prompt the dead to rise from their graves in an effort to silence the cacophony, but not Charlie. He barely twitched. The collector looked at the caller ID, which read, Bill. Randall gave an audible sigh of relief, then the phone finally fell silent. He had broken into the room the old-fashioned way, with an expertly applied butter knife to the lock when Charlie had failed to answer the door, which wasn't that surprising considering it was now nearly 2 a.m. Randall watched Charlie sleeping peacefully for a moment. He knew the phone call meant Fraker was probably on his way back, which meant he didn't have that much time. But why was he here? What was it about the kid that sparked his interest anyway? Was he really a potential collector? Seeing him now laying so innocently asleep, the thought seemed a little ludicrous, but still there was undeniably something about Charlie that warranted this intrusion. He knelt down next to the sofa so that he could get a better look at Charlie as his brow furrowed, and he let out a low moan, then shifted his position awkwardly. He was dreaming. "Charlie?" Randall said softly, but he didn't wake. Somewhere during his training deep within the void before his return, Randall had learned a thing or two about dream manipulation, and it had served him well over the years. But he didn't have the time for anything so complicated now, so he decided just to have a peek at what was going on inside that head of Charlie's. Randall rubbed his hands together and felt the instant heat as the power surged through them. Then with practiced precision he carefully rested the palm of his left hand on the back of Charlie's head and held it there as the 158 heat increased as the energy flowed through his hand and deep into the back of Charlie's brain, deep into his subconscious dreaming mind. "Now," Randall said softly as he closed his eyes and concentrated. "Let's see what we can see." "Charlie?" The voice was a whisper close to Charlie's ear. He jolted awake, expecting to see the speaker right next to him. "What? Huh?" Charlie sat up and looked groggily around the darkened room. He was alone, no one was leaning over him whispering his name. It took him a moment to orientate himself. He was still in the hotel room and realized he must have dozed off. He swung his legs around and sat up properly. That's when he saw Randall sitting in the chair opposite him. He was masked in the half-light, but definitely there. "Randall, Christ. You were sleeping," the American said. "What? No. Just resting my eyes," he blurted out as if a teacher had caught him sleeping in class. "Bill's not here, he's out." "So I see," Randall said and leaned forward so the meager light from outside finally hit his face. "Don't know where he's gone, I'm afraid," Charlie lied. He ran his hands through his messy hair in a vain attempt to flatten it. He shrugged and smiled awkwardly, not knowing what else to do. "You were dreaming," Randall said after a long pause. "While you were resting your eyes." "I was?" Charlie replied and felt the sudden need for light, so he reached across and turned on the lamp on the table in front of him. The harsh yellow light hurt his eyes, but at least he could see Randall better. An image from the dream flashed into his mind's eye for a second, then slowly faded like a flash bulb, briefly illuminating the scene until it finally melted back into darkness where it belonged. Strangely vivid, then gone in a heartbeat, but leaving behind a lingering melancholy. "Weird," Charlie said. Now he could barely remember what it had been, but the feeling of loss, of sorrow remained, which meant only one thing. "I was dreaming about my dad." "He's sick," Randall stated plainly. Yeah," Charlie nodded. "Hey, hang on, how did you know that?" he asked, certain he had ever even mentioned his father in front of Randall, let alone his condition. "Why would he? And it's serious," Randall said again without inflection. It was what it was, a statement of fact. The blunt truthfulness of Randall's tone weighed heavy on Charlie, and he exhaled sadly, but then caught himself and delivered the Walker party line on the issue. "Yeah, but he's going to be okay." He made the mistake of looking Randall in the eye, which instantly made the words the lie Charlie knew deep down they were, but he steeled himself to carry on with it regardless. "Sure, he's in hospital," he continued. "Just for tests though, you know? But he should be out any time now." He could feel the American's eyes on him, looking for any crack in the veneer. But this time Charlie made damn sure he didn't meet his gaze. "After an age," Randall said, "you know he's dying." Again the bluntness of his words hit Charlie hard. "What? No, he protested. "You don't know him, he's a tough old git. He'll be alright. For Christ's sake, he's only 65. People die a lot younger than 65, Charlie," Randall said. "Take my word for it. Truth. Hard and cold." "Yeah," Charlie managed, deflated. "I know. Like your mom." Charlie nodded. Wait a second. Hey, how the hell did you know my mom was dead?" Charlie asked, suddenly angry. He knew for damn sure he had never mentioned that to the Yank. He moved to get up, but his legs gave way and he sat back down on the sofa. "I can smell it on you," Randall replied. "What?" Charlie suddenly felt faint. His head was pounding, particularly at the back. He absently rubbed the back of his head and half expected to feel something clamped on there like a weight of some kind. But he realized the feeling wasn't on his head, it was inside the back of his skull, almost like a stone, heated by an open fire, white hot, burning a hole into his brain. Before he knew what had happened he was laid back on the sofa, and now that he couldn't remember ever having actually sat up. "Relax, Charlie," Randall said, his voice oddly soothing. "You're still sleeping." Of course, Charlie thought, that explains a lot, the strange feeling at the back of his mind, Randall's clairvoyance. But wait a second, he was awake, wasn't he? His eyes were open. Sure, he felt weird, but he was there, in the hotel room talking with the Yank, Wide awake if more than a little disorientated. Wide awake, he said out loud as if trying to convince himself. Just try and relax, Randall said, his voice inside Charlie's head now. It was so soft it made his eyelids heavy. If he hadn't been asleep before, he sure as shit was now. Wasn't he? What's happening to me? He slurred, as the room descended into darkness. What's? The word drifted off into the black which was all around him now. He was sure he was dying, but it felt okay, not so bad at all. Randall? His voice sounded a million miles away, barely recognizable as his own, so much so that he thought maybe he had just imagined he'd spoken. Perhaps he had. Charlie was lost now in total darkness. It wasn't simply a lack of light that engulfed him, it was an almost physical, oppressive tomb of black. He shouted, but the moment the sound left his lips it was swallowed up by the void he was drowning in. So much so that he began to doubt he had even made the sound in the first place. It was gone so suddenly. Perhaps he had just thought about screaming in terror and not actually uttered a word. He held his hand up to within an inch of his face but could see nothing, or at least he thought that was what he had done, but as with the phantom shout, maybe he had just imagined the action. After all, he couldn't even feel his breath on his hand if it was so close. Charlie was alone in an infinite dead space, and wondered if this was what death was like. Am I dead? He said, or dreamed he thought he'd said. No. At last a sound, a voice but not his own. No, not a sound, it was inside his head again. Wasn't it? It was familiar somehow, an American accent. Yes, the Yank, Randall's voice inside his head. Where am I? In a place between sleep and the waking world. The voice / thought inside his head replied cryptically. I'm scared. Don't be. But I can't feel anything. Can't hear or see or feel anything. Except scared. At least that was something to grasp hold of in the void. Fear. It wasn't the most comforting of anchors, but it was the only real thing he had at this point. You can hear me, Charlie. In a way. You sure I'm not dead? Positive. What are we doing here? In the space between sleep and the waking world? You were dreaming before. When I came in, you were dreaming about something, remember? No, I can't. You sure I'm not dead? You're still sleeping, kind of. This place is weird. You sure I'm actually here? Shit, that's a strange thing to say, think. Whatever it is I'm doing now, saying, thinking, that's all the same here, right? Saying and thinking. What am I doing? Saying or thinking? Right now? You're babbling. You know what this is like? Feels like tripping or something. Well, I say feels like, I can't feel anything. Yep, feels like tripping. Tripping? You know, LSD. Never tried it. I feel out of my body.